thanks so much to Dr. Kegel and to you all for the really splendid invitation to join you and to study together as commemorating this sad day. And of course that commemoration takes on special meaning and currency being here in Vienna. Vienna, of course, is a wonderful, culturally filled city, and many people come with a sense of its greatness, and luster, history, but we also know that the sad chapter of the Holocaust was as much attached to Vienna as almost anywhere in the world. So it's not just simply showing up in any place to give such a talk, but it's rather here. I know I gave the presentation last year at this time at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. Cornell is a very chashuva university, one of the Ivy League schools, in this beautiful setting in Ithaca, and it's so glamorous and so exalted, so high up on the scale of learning. But in terms of these events, it felt like we were on another planet. But here, we're on the planet by being in Vienna in terms of the commemoration of these events. And what we'll do is to, I hope together, to study together, to commemorate together, to explore together. I'll have some remarks for about a half an hour, 40 minutes, something like that. And then we'll have conversation, if that seems good to all concerned. And in that way, hopefully do justice to what we're trying to accomplish. And I'll say more about that in just a second, regarding what it is that what we would try to accomplish with such a commemoration, what I have to bring working on a book as I am on calendars in the Holocaust. But let me just amplify for a moment what Dr. Kegel said about me, to share a little bit more about myself and what brings me to this. I was born in Los Angeles, California, actually in Hollywood, California. Has anyone heard of Hollywood?
No.
That was a resounding contribution. So, and then went to Boston University for study first in philosophy and then in literature. So I'm not by any means a dyed-in-the-wool historian, meaning I'm not a real-life historian, even though my most recent book was published under the rubric of history, but really try to be a literary scholar. And then I taught for some time in Boston, and then went to Israel about 20 years ago. All my children have been born there. We live in Jerusalem, but I come to the States frequently, both with my family, but also to lecture. So there's between both worlds. I grew up in not a religious household at all, so my going to pursue academic degrees and wanting to study was just a natural part of growing up there. And it was only later that I became religious. And so it's been, as Dr. Kegel was saying, it's been a exploration of its own of knitting together these two halves of a life. That is always, it's always interesting, at least for me, I don't know for others, but always interesting, but not always simple, because the world of academia, of college study, of university study, of which I've taught and studied in many and lectured to over 100 universities, are not always sympathetic to religious points of view. It's felt that the university has to be a place where if you're religious, you set that kind of aside, you take off your hat, as I did here, but not for that reason. You take off your hat and you put it to the side and you speak without a religious vocabulary. So, and then from the other side, if you're speaking like here in a shul, you don't speak academically, but you speak with using the vocabulary of Torah, of Chazal, of the sages, and that's the way you speak. So to find a way to knit together this vocabulary has been part of my ongoing exploration. And while I've tried to do that in all of the books that I've written and the teaching that I do, this particular project on calendars in the Holocaust is that where I try to fuse them, try to join them together in the most clear way. And I'll say more about that, and then maybe at the end you'll let me know if I'm successful or what I need to do to be more successful. Absolutely, I'm absolutely sincere in that. How they meet or how they collide and cause sparks of a not necessarily positive kind. So, let's then, with that said, let's begin with just a very basic history of what Kristallnacht that we're commemorating on this day is. How many of you have heard before and know something of what Kristallnacht is? So you may know quite a lot. So let's say something about what it is, and then also turn to the name, Kristallnacht, because that's part of the exploration, commemoration, and some would say the problem. So Kristallnacht was a pogrom, meaning an act of destruction perpetrated, unleashed, brought against the Jewish communities of Germany and Austria, where we are, in the year 1938, fall of 1938, in the Gregorian calendar. It came out, usually it's said on November 9th, but truly most of that destruction took place on November 10th in the Gregorian calendar. It resulted in the deaths of immediate deaths caused by just outright flagrant murder of over 90 Jews, whose names we'll in a second come to, because I think it's crucial for them to be remembered not only vaguely but also in person. It also was a pogrom, meaning an act of violence unleashed by the Nazis, Yamach against Jewish property, which meant Jewish shuls, like this, God forbid. Here in Austria, in Vienna, and all through Germany. Most of the shuls, most of the synagogues of Germany and Austria were destroyed by fire. The numbers vary extraordinary of how many, anywhere from some 200 to some say over 1,000. And in terms, just parenthetically, as an academic historical study, it's one of the figures trying to see how many shuls were destroyed, that there's no consensus and the figures vary so greatly that it's highly unusual. But the most reliable estimates, say that by the great historian Shoah Friedlander, suggest 267 synagogues were destroyed by fire over that day, or 2 days. And other Jews were injured. The name Kristallnacht comes because shops which had a glass as their shop windows made of crystal glass were shattered as acts of vandalism, of violence against the shops. And those number in the thousands. And then, in the aftermath, that the results were at least as grave. Meaning, many Jews who were not injured directly, unfortunately in the aftermath, were so despairing of their future that they took their own lives. Numbered, it's said, in the hundreds. And there were some 30,000 arrests made at that time and in the immediate aftermath of Jewish men who were then taken to concentration camps. And most were released and were, some of them, able to immigrate, to leave. Others were released and did not, and still others were never released. So the figures of those who were affected start with already a sizable contingent of those whose lives were destroyed or transformed. But even in the aftermath, that contingent, that group, was even of a larger scope and size. And this event, having taken place on the 9th or 10th of November, 1938, or, and here I just want to introduce another facet that we'll come back to, or on Tet Zion, the 16th day of the month of MarCheshvan, in the Jewish calendar of the year Tov Reish Sadi Tet, 5699. That often is seen both by historians and the populace generally as the initial act of that set in motion the destruction that we now call the Holocaust. That act was set in motion, just to enlarge the history a bit, but without going into a lot of detail, was set in motion because Germany had forced from Germany many Jews, thousands of Jews, who were Polish Jews, and who did not have, according to the to the government then in power, the Nazi MarCheshvan government in power, did not have a right to reside in Germany. They were forced to Poland. They were at first not allowed. This was in summer of 1938, not allowed to cross the border and go into Poland, and had to live a life in no man's land between one country and another. Eventually they were allowed into Poland, but under very difficult conditions. And one of those families was named Greenspan, and the son of that family was based in Paris. And he, to revenge what was deemed this evil act against the Jews, which included his parents and family, went into the German embassy in Paris and shot the highest official that seemed to be there at that particular time on November 7th, 1938, whose name was Von Rott, Yimak Shemo. His name should be blotted out. And he then was, Herschel Greenspan was apprehended, put in jail. Von Rott was lingering between life and death for 2 days, and he then died on November 9th, at which time then the highest officials of the Germans felt that they could give license to their cohorts, those who were in the German police and military, to carry out violence against the Jews in revenge, and that should not be stopped, including murder, including beatings, including the burning of synagogues and the destruction of Jewish property. So all that was carried out with the organization of the highest officials in Germany, even though they disguised it as coming from popular fervor, and had that result. In Vienna itself, again, the numbers vary as to the destruction that took place, but at least 8 Jews were beaten to death terribly, tragically in Vienna. 20 of what were said, 21 shuls in the immediate center of Vienna were burned and destroyed, and thousands of shops owned by Jews were vandalized with, again, broken glass. So that's the history that forms the background, the sad, the terrible, the tragic history that forms the background. So there's a number of facets, now with that in mind, that come to our attention. First of all, it is a commemoration of loss. It's a commemoration of a watershed, meaning an event after which the world was no longer the same, I would suggest. Not only the Jewish world, but also the world at large. And in that event, Jewish lives were lost. And on this day that this took place, meaning the 16th day of MarCheshvan, when we come to that date, which took place last Wednesday night and Thursday, we're right between the dates in the calendars of the 2 different calendars, the Jewish calendar on the one hand, the Gregorian calendar, the secular Christian calendar on the other, which we honor this date on November 9th, November 10th, that on that day of MarCheshvan, the families of those who lost their lives will today continue to say Kaddish, will light a memorial candle, will lead the prayers in Shul. So it's anything but remote, certainly, for the descendants of those who were there on that day. And some of the names of those who lost their lives: Alexander Falk, Josephine Baer, Bernhard Rosenfeld, Leopold Plachta, Leopold Schowens, Martin Kabliner, Max Freundlich, Selma Wininski, Susanna Stern, and Richard Berger. May their neshamas have an aliyah from that day, as we see in this senseless act of destroying innocent lives, where families clearly were left bereft, left empty from what took place. We also, as I said, want to come back to the name and how that influences our sense of the event and the commemoration. The name that it's called, in one of its versions, is Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. But it has other names. Reich Kristallnacht, Reich Pogromsnacht, Night of Pogroms, in English, Night of Broken Glass, November 9th, and just Kristallnacht 1938. So what's involved with these names is that in the United States, in Canada, in places that are further away, there's a tremendous dedication to the name Kristallnacht. That image of broken glass, of the destruction of Jewish property, is that seems to capture the imagination and to hone in on the sheer violence of what took place then. In Europe, particularly in Germany and Austria, for those that are more sincere and they're trying to commemorate this day, that the name Kristallnacht is felt to be a euphemism, meaning to be something that, what really happened on that day? I mean, the loss of life and the terrible destruction of shuls and Sifrei Torah and Sifrei Kodesh, sacred books and sacred Torahs. It hides it all. It makes it like there was an act of vandalism and that's it. But it removes it from what was directed against the Jews. So those who are most sincere and scholars that hone in on this event, and more sophisticated popular opinion prefers having pogrom as part of the title. Meaning pogrom was the name that came first in Russian from the 1880s, talking about mass violence against Jews. And so it's felt that that does far more justice. That doesn't disguise what happened. So that there is a sense in which this day there's some controversy which has to be either more connected with what actually happened or less connected with what happened. Now, this date, as I mentioned, there's really not just a date, but at least 2 or 3 dates. Let's start for just the secular calendar and the incredible complicatedness of the date within the secular calendar, November 9th or November 10th. So it is said that on November 9th, from those that look most closely, actually there was little violence that took place comparatively on November 9th, and most of it began to be unleashed in the early morning hours of November 10th. And accelerated during that day, and that's the day when the fury of the pogrom reached its height, particularly certainly in Vienna, where the plaques have only November 10th. But November 9th has been the date that has been sealed, it seems, in stone for this event within those who observe the Gregorian calendar. And it's likely the reason is an act of telescoping of the calendar. And I'll say exactly what I mean by that. This date of November 9th is already commemorated by the Nazis, MarCheshvan, themselves. Because on November 9th of 1918, that was the day of the abdication of the king in Germany at the end of the First World War. That was the day that a republic was declared. That was the day that an armistice was signed. That was felt to be a stab in the back. And so the Nazis, MarCheshvan, may they be blotted out, took that date as a day of infamy, as a day of being sold out, as a date of betrayal, and commemorated that every year. Most infamously, it was on that date that in 1923 that Hitler, MarCheshvan, led what was called a push, an attempt at a revolution in Munich to try to overthrow the new Republic of Germany at that time, the new democratic republic that the Nazis, MarCheshvan, felt was a sellout, a betrayal, was selling Germany down the river. And so he attempted to overthrow that and failed and was put into prison on that date, on November 9th. And so once the Nazis came to power, Nazis, MarCheshvan, came to power, that every November 9th was then commemorated as the anniversary not only of the selling out of Germany, but also of this failed revolution. And it was commemorated by a march that Hitler, MarCheshvan, led to the graves of those who had been killed during the time of the attempted overthrow. And they would have the blood-stained clothes of those who had been wounded or killed, and the flags that were there, and the march would take place. And not only that, but he would give a special speech on that night that proclaimed the reason for their being in power. And it was also so terribly and famously the night in which the SS, MarCheshvan, the special cruel force that was used to terrorize, it was the night that the new enlistees were inducted into service. On that night, on November 9th. So, November 9th was charged with this kind of evil horizon from 1918 on, and some, which we won't go into now, would even see that there's associations that date back even earlier than that. So, when von Rath, the MarCheshvan, was shot on November 7th and lingered, it is said that the higher echelons were just waiting for the opportunity to unleash the pogrom that would coincide with that commemoration. And that's exactly what happened. Now, I'm emphasizing this to show how complicated it is. Meaning, for those of us that commemorate according to the Gregorian calendar, which is most of the world that feels summoned to do this, and it's a very generous gesture. Really, in the United States, I know there's many communities who are not so Jewishly connected, but they feel still that they want to commemorate the losses of this day, or even non-Jewish communities that feel called upon, and similarly in Germany and in Austria as well. But yet, when we take stock, what the commemoration of this event does is to do this on the very day that was hallowed, that was seen to be sacred in such an evil way by the Nazis. That November 9th. So it seems that can go two ways. That it can either be, well, most who organize such events are not sensitized to the backdrop there and do the commemorations rather indifferent or unknowing to what was the horizon that was the commemoration for the enemy. Or, and I think we would like to, certainly we Hasidim and others would like to see it, that what one does by commemorating on November 9th, or the special possibility that's there by doing it on this day, is to take what a date that was so saturated with evil and to turn it around with an awareness of exactly what happened, but to flip it on its head. To show that, they may have commemorated for these reasons. They may have commemorated with an eye toward the destruction and to gather momentum for their destruction. But we are commemorating losses that are not, it's not an agenda of violence. It's not an agenda of revenge. It rather is an agenda of commemoration and a way to be able to turn the future differently. So that's one zone that can be taken account of. The other, as I mentioned, is the fact that there's a different calendar, meaning the Jewish calendar, on which this day can be commemorated. But very interestingly, even though that's the day, the 16th day of the month of MarCheshvan, remembering we're still today or tonight in the month of MarCheshvan, tonight begins the 21st day of the month of MarCheshvan in the Jewish calendar, and it's that day that we use to mark the anniversary of loss. It's that day that we use to commemorate those who have passed into the next world. It's that day that, for example, we in Jewish life commemorate catastrophes, other pogroms that have taken place against the Jewish people. Especially, of course, unfortunately, tragically that it's with us, but the 9th day of the month of Av, of Menachem Av, that commemorates the destruction of the two ancient temples in Jerusalem and 3 other sad events in ancient history, and then many events that through the medieval period and even into the modern period took place on that day, including, some would suggest, the outbreak of World War I taking place on that day as well. But within a Jewish orbit, one usually turns to the Jewish calendar, because it's felt that the Jewish calendar is not arbitrary, that every day has its own meaning, its own specific significance, and if something took place on that day, it's there ingrained into the day. It's not like you can shuffle them around and do it at another time. Just like the Sabbath, Shabbos, Shabbat takes place on a particular day, and we can't say, well, because there's going to be a rally, or because the weather's not good, or because I have a test that day, that you suspend the Shabbos and say, okay, it can just as well happen on another day. No, it's firmly locked into the calendar. So it is with those days that are to commemorate Jewish catastrophe. But strikingly, Kristallnacht, or the night of the pogrom, or as it's sometimes called, very, very revealingly, the November pogrom, has almost never been commemorated publicly according to the Jewish calendar. And this is even more of a mystery when we come to the fact that, for example, in the United States, which I'm sorry if I talk about that, I know that somewhat better. I'm from there, as I said, from Hollywood of all places, and hail from the United States and know what goes on a little bit better than in Europe. That in the United States, Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, it takes place on Kof Zayin Nisan, the 27th day of the month of Nisan in the Jewish calendar. Even for the government of the United States, meaning through an act of Congress, the Jewish calendar orchestrates that day. It's the only such day where Jewish time grips America and choreographs all the actions that are there. The only time. But in contrast, this day, the November pogrom, has been relegated to the secular, the Christian, the Gregorian calendar. So, and there's two reasons that I could suggest. One is that, as we heard, November 9th, with all of this baggage, with all of this evil horizon saturated, may be so attractive, even subliminally, meaning under the cover sometimes, that it was used to flip things around. And that flip from the evil of the Nazis, MarCheshvan, to our different agenda is so attractive in saying, no, we won't follow that way. That itself is inviting. But another reason may be that in the Jewish calendar, we don't only move through the Jewish year that each date is independent of the other. There's Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and then there's Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and then there's Sukkot, the holiday, the festival of booths, and then there's Hanukkah, and then there is Purim, and then there, God willing, is Pesach, Passover, and then Shavuot. That, yes, they're great and special in their own way. But we also see a movement through the year, an unfolding of the calendar, a meaning. The calendar, the Jewish calendar itself, is a text to be read. And were time permitted, and hopefully in my book, I will show this, how the movement is such to show a drama, just like the drama of going from the 10 days from Rosh Hashanah to that of Yom Kippur, which is a culmination. It's not there only in its own way. And to Sukkot that follows. So after the time of deep introspection and penance and soul searching and soul beating, as we pound our hearts on Yom Kippur, we come to Sukkot, which then moves beyond that another step to the joy that's there. And we even take the 4 species, the lulav and esrog, and we bring them to exactly that place that we've been pounding, to show that we've gone another step, another notch. So, now back to Kristallnacht, back to the commemoration in the different calendars. So I want to suggest that maybe that we move through the year in terms of commemoration of the Holocaust, the beginning of the Holocaust, this terrible pogrom, loss of life, loss of property, mass loss, and loss of the sacred, of shuls, of Sifrei Torah, that loss set things in motion at the beginning. And we start then with the secular calendar because it's not yet fully a part of us. But then when we come to Yom HaShoah, that we move to a different way of entering into commemoration. One that is completely at home with being a Jew, completely resonant with Jewish commemoration of these events, which takes in the whole, not just the beginning, but takes in the whole. And so it itself is an evolution as we go through the calendar, from an event that's only fragmented in there at the beginning with our observance of this destruction to one that's later on. Meaning we'll come to a further whole only in the month of Nisan. Now, it should just be said parenthetically and quickly, but importantly, that there's a lot of controversy about Yom HaShoah, about commemorating the Holocaust in the month of Nisan, which is the month of joy, and that it should better be done on the 9th of Av, or at some other time where sadness is the appropriate register. But I'm, for the moment, just suggesting a way to be able to see the movement of these 2 events. So I want to then conclude that that what we've then gone to see is both the history of this event that we're here to commemorate, the loss of life, the terrible snuffing out of lives and families that commenced in terrible earnest at the time of this event. And then we have to hear the echo of that deeply with these names of Alexander Falk, Josephine Bayer, and others. And that we know that it's important to commemorate because it is seen to be the beginning. And we know now, we've tried to go another step by knowing the baggage that was attached to the secular day. And so what we're doing is not simple by any means. Meaning it takes tremendous energy to transform this date to something that has a profile, a horizon of being able to bring good and bring repair of what was lost into the world. And we know that that is the struggle that we each, in our own way, will have to figure out how to do. And yet we also know that there's a Jewish state there in the background in which these losses are commemorated, that candles are lit, that we may on that day, for example, feel that the appropriate response for all those shuls that were lost, that changed the landscape of Europe. At that moment, in a single night, 1,000 years of Europe was transformed. And the homes that Jews had established for the sacred, for Kedusha, suffered a terrible, terrible blow. And so what we may want to do is to dedicate ourselves on that day in some way, shape, or form to the rehabilitation of that by buying a sacred book for a synagogue, or by donating money that can help the synagogue be able to better serve its community, or being able to repair a synagogue, offer ourselves to be able to do if it's in need. Meaning, some way to be able to say, no, it didn't disappear. That sacredness has every legitimacy to be, and even needs to grow further. And then I suggested that where we come to is the evolution of the calendar that starts in the fall, moves to the spring, and it's only then that we can hope to take in truly the full damage that was suffered during the Holocaust here in Vienna, in Warsaw, in Lvov, and elsewhere. And to set our sights on the repair of that. And to be here in Vienna with you, who have come here to study, we know that one's footsteps lead one to where they need to go. We're taught in Hasidus and Hasidism. It's a fundamental teaching that one doesn't go there by coincidence, one doesn't go there casually, but one comes to a certain place to do something that's needed in that place. And certainly I feel, I don't know if I've done something that's needed or foisted this upon you, but it's a privilege to be with you. And I think to see those that, as I look out, who have come to Vienna, all of you with a mission. And I feel that that mission is tied, is joined to the night of the November pogrom, the night that we commemorate in MarCheshvan. And I will learn from you eventually how that truly could be repaired. Thank you.